History lies. It tells you Troy was myth, a poet's dream, a stage for gods who never walked this earth. Yet beneath the soil of Hazarlik, stone walls whisper of fire, of blood, of a city torn open like a carcass. Homer wrote of 10 years of siege, of Helen's stolen beauty igniting armies, of Hector dragged lifeless in the dust, of Achilles consumed by rage. But what if it was not story? What if it was memory, half-buried, retold by tongues that refused to let the truth die? The Hittite tablets name Walusa, they name Ahiawa, they speak of war across the sea. And in that name, Walusa, lurks the ghost of Ilios, Troy's forgotten self. Did kings of flesh, not myth, stand beneath those burning walls? Did ships blacken the horizon? Did spears splinter? Did bones feed the ground where archaeologists now sift in silence? And the horse, was it wood, was it metaphor, was it terror disguised? No answer settles. No truth holds still. What stands is a wound carved into history's flesh, half legend, half ruin, bleeding across 3,000 years. Step too close and you feel it pulse. A war that refuses to stay dead. A war that may never have ended. It begins with words that shook the ancient world. Words carried not on parchment but in memory, sung by generations of poets until they were finally written down centuries later. The Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to a blind bard called Homer, were not simple tales meant for entertainment. They were the backbone of identity for a civilization, the bedrock of what it meant to be Greek. In them were war, betrayal, longing, and the agony of mortality. They were hymns to glory, but also reminders of its terrible cost. The Iliad, set in the last year of a decade-long war, refused to present battle as clean or heroic. It was soaked in blood and loss. The rage of Achilles, his wrath against Agamemnon, his thirst for vengeance after Hector killed his beloved Patroclus, became the central force of the poem. Around that rage, armies clashed, gods interfered, and fates were sealed. It was not merely a story of combat. It was the anatomy of destruction, told through the broken bodies of heroes. Hector, the Trojan prince, fell not as a villain but as the noblest defender of his doomed city. His corpse dragged by Achilles' chariot in a vision that Greeks memorized for centuries. The Odyssey took the war's embers and carried them home. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, wandered for 10 years after Troy's fall, facing storms, monsters, and temptations. Yet beneath its surface, the poem was not about the supernatural. It was about endurance, about the slow, grinding struggle of a man desperate to return to his family. His battles were not only against enemies but against time, memory, and his own weariness. In both epics, every line carried weight. They were not written in haste but forged through oral tradition, shaped over centuries until they became monuments of language. From the very beginning, the Trojan War was not history alone, nor myth alone. It became the defining story of the Greek world. Generations of schoolboys in Athens recited Homer's verses as moral training, absorbing lessons of courage and cunning, betrayal and loyalty. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, argued that Homer shaped Greek education more than any teacher or lawgiver. The poems were not distant entertainment. They were memory and moral code, carried into battle by hoplites, echoed in tragedies performed in the theaters of Athens, and etched into the very idea of Hellenism. To be Greek was to know Homer, but the war itself, did it exist? The poems were written down around the late 8th century BCE, long after the supposed conflict. If the Trojan War happened, it would have taken place in the late Bronze Age, around the 12th or 13th century BCE. That left a gap of nearly 5 centuries between event and record. In that gulf, truth could dissolve, reshape, or vanish entirely. Yet the Greeks never doubted. They believed their ancestors had fought at Troy, and that their heroes had walked among men. Achilles, Hector, Helen, and Odysseus were not merely characters. They were threads binding the living to the dead. Helen was said to be the most beautiful woman in the world, her abduction or elopement, with Paris of Troy igniting the war. For Greeks, she embodied both the danger and allure of desire, the spark that could topple kingdoms. Priam, the aged king of Troy, became the archetype of tragic authority, kneeling before Achilles to beg for his son's mutilated body. Achilles himself symbolized the ultimate paradox of the hero: unmatched strength, but fated to die young. His very existence questioned whether glory outweighed life. These figures were not invented lightly. They became templates for all who came after, haunting the Greek imagination. In Sparta, men were trained to be new Achilles. In Athens, leaders quoted Homer to justify policy. In Rome, centuries later, Virgil would write the Aeneid as a continuation of Troy's story, making Aeneas the ancestor of Rome itself. The Trojan War, whether real or not, became the seedbed of Western identity. Yet archaeology brings unsettling silence. No contemporary Bronze Age text from Greece mentions a Trojan War. No linear B-tablet records ships sailing east to fight for Helen. The Hittite Empire, ruling Anatolia at the time, left records of conflicts with a land called Walusa, which scholars identify with Ilios, the Greek name for Troy. They wrote of Ahioa, a foreign power across the sea, widely believed to mean the Achaeans, Homer's Greeks. These texts hint at real hostilities, disputes over vassal states, struggles for control of trade routes through the Dardanelles. But nowhere is Helen mentioned. Nowhere is a decade-long war recorded. What remains is fragmentary, suggestive, but never conclusive. When the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann arrived at Hizarlik in the 1870s, he believed without doubt that he was uncovering Homer's Troy. His methods were destructive, tearing through layers of settlement in haste, but what he exposed changed history. Beneath the soil lay the remains of at least 9 different cities, each built on the ruins of the last. Some were small fortresses, others sprawling towns. Among them, Troy 6 and Troy Vaia, destroyed in the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, show evidence of violent ends. Collapsed walls, signs of fire, scattered human remains. Whether those ruins matched Homer's vision was another matter. The Greeks of Homer's time had no maps of the Bronze Age, no written record of that distant past. What they had was memory carried through song. The Iliad and Odyssey were not written history but oral tradition polished over centuries. Each bard, each Aiwados, recited the poems with variations, adding details, cutting others, until the stories hardened into the forms we know. In that process, fact blurred with invention. A raid might become a decade-long war. A simple ruse might become a wooden horse hiding warriors. A local skirmish might swell into the clash of gods and nations. And yet, the emotional truth mattered more than literal accuracy. Greeks accepted the poems as history because they carried the weight of truth, if not the precision of it. They reflected the brutality of real war, the grief of real loss, the longing for home that every soldier understood. Whether or not Helen stood on Troy's walls, whether or not Achilles ever lived, the Greeks saw themselves in those stories. They were not simply listening to old tales. They were looking into a mirror polished by centuries of memory. The Trojan War was thus both myth and origin. It was the story through which Greeks explained their world, their honor, their gods, and their place in history. It shaped how they viewed heroism, how they defined enemies, how they justified power. To question its reality was to question Greek identity itself. Yet even as Homer's words lit fires in the hearts of men, the silence of history remained. A war that may or may not have happened became the most influential war ever remembered, and it left behind a paradox that continues to haunt every reader who steps into its verses. The Greeks themselves were never certain. Centuries after the supposed war, debates already raged. Some believed Troy had stood as Homer described, a city brought down by fire and betrayal. Others doubted, suggesting that the epic was memory reshaped into song, not fact. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, accepted that a war had occurred but questioned whether Helen had even been in Troy at all. Thucydides, the stern historian of the Peloponnesian War, treated the Trojan War as history but stripped it of gods and miracles, describing it instead as the largest military expedition of the age. Even in antiquity, the line between truth and legend blurred. The Greeks lived in the shadow of Homer, yet they too struggled with the same question. Was Troy a city of stone or a city of words? For centuries, the West inherited the poems but not the city. Troy slipped into the realm of myth. Medieval scholars repeated the story without certainty of its geography. Renaissance humanists argued over whether it had stood at all. The soil of Anatolia kept its silence. It was not until the 19th century that a man arrived determined to force the earth to speak, Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann was not an archaeologist in the modern sense. Born in 1822 in Mecklenburg, he made his fortune in trade before turning to his obsession with Homer. He believed the Iliad was literal history, a record of real men and battles. His conviction was absolute. In 1870, with fortune in hand and Homer in memory, he began digging at Hizarlik, a mound in northwestern Turkey long suspected by some scholars to conceal Troy. His approach was crude, tearing through layers with haste and dynamite, but his finds electrified Europe. Beneath the mound were not one but many Troys. The site revealed 9 major settlements, each built upon the ruins of the last, spanning from the early Bronze Age around 3000 BCE to the Roman period. Schliemann believed he had struck the city of Priam when he uncovered what he called Priam's treasure, a cache of gold, silver, and bronze objects. But he was wrong. The layer he attributed to Priam dated to Troy II, around 2500 BCE, more than 1,000 years too early. Yet error did not diminish the revelation. Troy was no myth. A great city had stood at Hizarlik, and it had been destroyed not once but many times. Later archaeologists returned with greater precision. Wilhelm Dorpfeld, working with Schliemann and later alone, recognized that Troy VI, a city flourishing between 1700 and 1250 BCE, matched far more closely Homer's descriptions. Troy VI was vast by Bronze Age standards, encircled by massive limestone walls, its towers and gates suggesting wealth and power. The city fell violently around 1250 BCE, its walls collapsed, its homes destroyed. For many, this became the prime candidate for Homer's Troy. Yet the story did not end there. Further excavation revealed Troy VIA, built directly upon the ruins of Troy VI. This city was smaller, poorer, but densely packed, its houses crowded and hastily constructed. Around 1180 BCE, it too was destroyed. Archaeological evidence shows fire and human remains, signs of violence rather than simple abandonment. For others, this was the true Troy of the war, destroyed at exactly the same time as the broader collapse of Bronze Age civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean. The debate sharpened: Troy VI or Troy VIA? Troy VI was grand, a city worthy of the epics, destroyed around 1250 BCE. But its destruction appears to have been caused by earthquake, not siege. No weapons, no mass graves, no clear sign of conquest. Troy VIA, in contrast, bore the marks of human attack, fire, and death. Its fall around 1180 BCE aligned with the wider turmoil of the late Bronze Age collapse, when the Hittite Empire disintegrated and trade networks collapsed. Yet Troy VIA lacked the grandeur described by Homer. It was a city in decline, not a fortress of kings. Archaeology thus offered fragments, not answers. Troy was real. Wars had scarred it. But whether those wars were the war of Achilles and Hector remained unresolved. The mound of Hizarlik became a palimpsest of destruction. Troy I, a small settlement around 3000 BCE, fell to fire. Troy II, rich and fortified, collapsed around 2500 BCE. Troy V ended violently around 1900 BCE. Troy VI, the proud city of towers, fell around 1250 BCE. Troy VIA, the crowded city, was burned around 1180 BCE. And centuries later, during the Roman period, Troy IX thrived as Ilium, honored by emperors who traced their ancestry to Aeneas. Each destruction added another layer of mystery, another possible face for Homer's city. What Schliemann uncovered was not the certainty of the Trojan War, but the undeniable truth that a city called Troy had existed, had flourished, and had been destroyed again and again. The Greeks had not invented a name from nothing. Troy had been real. The question was which Troy Homer remembered, and how much of that memory had been reshaped by centuries of song. Inscriptions from the Hittite archives added weight. Tablets from the 13th century BCE, discovered at Hattusa, mention a city called Wilusa and conflicts with a power named Ahiawa. Scholars recognized Wilusa as Ilios, one of the Greek names for Troy, and Ahiawa as the Achaeans, the Homeric Greeks. One tablet even mentions a conflict involving a ruler named Alexandru of Wilusa, a name echoing Alexandros, another name for Paris. These records did not confirm Homer's tale, but they proved that a city resembling Troy existed and that Greeks fought in its shadow. The soil of Hizarlik, the shattered walls of Troy 6, the ashes of Troy Vae, the brittle tablets of Hattusa, all testified to a past that could not be dismissed. But they left the central question unresolved. Which destruction was Homer's war? Was it the earthquake of Troy 6, transformed in memory into the sack by Achaeans? Or was it the fiery end of Troy Vae, a true war remembered in fragments? Every spade thrust into the ground at Hizarlik unearthed more layers, more cities, more doubts. Schliemann's crude triumph gave way to decades of careful archaeology, yet certainty never came. Troy remained both fact and myth, stone and song, its ruins offering proof of existence but not of epic. The city had been found, but the war lingered in shadow, suspended between earth and story, forever refusing to declare which ruin bore the weight of Homer's words. In the centuries before Homer's words were sung, the world of the late Bronze Age was already a web of power, conflict, and ambition stretching across the eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean Greece, with its citadels of stone, stood at its western edge. The Hittite Empire, formidable and disciplined, ruled Anatolia and pressed its authority deep into Syria. Between them lay the Aegean and the Dardanelles, where Troy held its ground, positioned like a sentinel at the crossing of seas. Whoever controlled that narrow strait between the Aegean and the Black Sea controlled trade, wealth, and power itself. The Mycenaean Greeks were not a single people united under one king. They were a mosaic of rival palaces, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, each ruled by its own wanax or king. Their citadels rose with monumental architecture, their walls built of massive stones that later Greeks would call Cyclopean, as if only giants could have moved them. Linear B tablets record their economies with clinical precision. Grain, oil, bronze, slaves, weapons. They were societies driven by hierarchy, martial in culture, bound by tribute, and rich enough to command fleets of ships. Their trade reached Cyprus for copper, Egypt for luxury, Anatolia for gold and silver. They were not isolated warriors but part of a vast interconnected world. East across the Aegean, the Hittite Empire reigned as one of the great superpowers of the late Bronze Age. Centered in Hattusa in central Anatolia, it commanded vassal states from western Turkey to northern Syria. Its kings styled themselves as great kings, equals to the pharaohs of Egypt. In treaties and correspondence, the Hittites negotiated with rulers across the Near East. Yet to the west of their core lands, their grip was contested. The region the Hittites called Arzawa, stretching toward the Aegean coast, was constantly unstable, a frontier where local kings sought independence and foreign powers interfered. It was in this contested space that Troy, or Wilusa, as the Hittite texts call it, stood. The Dardanelles, the thin strait linking the Aegean to the Black Sea, was more than geography. It was a lifeline of trade. Ships from Greece passed through to reach the Black Sea for timber, grain, and metals. Control of this passage meant control of wealth and influence. Troy's position at Hizarlik placed it directly on this artery. Its wealth did not come only from its own land, but from its ability to regulate, tax, and profit from this trade. A city of merchants and warriors, its gates open to goods that moved across continents, and its walls protected those profits. To Mycenaean Greeks seeking access to resources and markets, Troy could be both a partner and an obstacle. The Hittite archives, discovered in the 20th century in the ruins of Hattusa, bring this world into focus with a stark clarity. Clay tablets written in cuneiform preserve treaties, letters, and complaints that speak of real conflicts in western Anatolia. In them, Wilusa appears not as a legend but as a living city. One treaty, made under King Muwatalli II in the early 13th century BCE, records peace between the Hittites and a ruler of Wilusa. The city was not marginal. It was important enough to stand in the diplomatic records of an empire. Even more striking are references to a Western power the Hittites called Ahiwa. Scholars widely identify this with the Achaeans, the very Greeks of Homer's poems. The tablets speak of the Ahiwa as formidable, capable of interfering in Anatolia and challenging Hittite interests. A letter from a Hittite king complains that the Ahiwa supported rebels in western Anatolia, disrupting Hittite control. Another refers to conflict over a vassal territory, with the Ahiwa seemingly backing a rival claimant. These records suggest that Greeks were not distant observers but active participants in Anatolia's politics, clashing with the Hittites and their allies. One tablet from around 1280 BCE mentions a figure named Alexandru, ruler of Walusa. The similarity of the name to Alexandros, the Greek name for Paris of Troy, has fueled endless debate. Was Alexandru the historical kernel behind the Paris of myth? The evidence does not allow certainty, but the coincidence is too close to ignore. It places Walusa in direct connection with both the Hittites and the Greeks, and it demonstrates that Troy was no forgotten backwater but a significant player in the geopolitics of the Late Bronze Age. The timing of these records aligns with the height of Mycenaean power. In the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, the Mycenaean world flourished. Linear B archives record their wealth and organization, their palaces filled with gold, their armies equipped with bronze weapons, their fleets capable of striking across the Aegean. Their influence reached into Anatolia, just as the Hittites' power pressed westward. Troy stood between them, a city bound to the Hittites yet tied to the Aegean. It was a fault line of empire, where trade, power, and ambition collided. Archaeology at Hizarlik reinforces this image. Troy 6, flourishing from about 1700 to 1250 BCE, shows evidence of wealth. Its fortifications were monumental. Walls up to 5 meters thick, built of limestone blocks, towers projecting outward, gates carefully engineered. Within, the houses grew larger and more complex, a sign of prosperity. Imported pottery from Greece has been found at the site, proof of trade across the Aegean. The city was not isolated. It was part of the same world that produced Mycenae's palaces and Hattus's archives. When Troy 6 was destroyed around 1250 BCE, the collapse was catastrophic. Whether earthquake or attack, the event left the city in ruins. Yet it was rebuilt almost immediately as Troy VIA, cramped and hastily organized. This suggests a population under pressure, perhaps refugees crowded inside its walls, perhaps a city bracing for war. Its destruction around 1180 BCE, with clear evidence of fire and violence, coincided with the wider Bronze Age collapse. The Hittite Empire fell. Mycenaean palaces burned. Trade networks disintegrated. Across the Mediterranean, civilizations that had endured for centuries crumbled within a generation. It is within this chaos that the possibility of a Trojan War becomes most plausible. The Greeks, the Ahiwa, were present in Anatolia. The Hittite texts confirm their involvement. Walusa was real, standing on the straits, wealthy, fortified, and worth fighting for. The Mycenaean world had both the power and the motive to wage war across the sea. And when Troy VIA burned around 1180 BCE, the timing matched the very period when Homer later placed his war. The Late Bronze Age was not a peaceful era of trade alone, but a stage of rival powers locked in constant tension. Mycenaean kings sent expeditions eastward. Hittite kings demanded loyalty from their vassals. Egypt fought its own battles against the Hittites, most famously at Kadesh in 1274 BCE. Assyria pressed from the east. And in the middle, Troy's walls rose against both time and ambition. To control Troy was to control the straits. To lose it was to surrender wealth. In such a world, a war between Greeks and Trojans was not only possible but inevitable. The past does not shout its answers, but the Late Bronze Age leaves enough to know its texture. Palaces burning in Greece, Hittite tablets naming Walusa, fortifications uncovered at Hizarlik, shards of Greek pottery on Anatolian soil, all speak to a world balanced on conflict. Homer's war may be poetry, but it was born in an age where war was constant, and Troy was at its center. Homer's war begins not with armies but with a woman. Helen of Sparta, called the most beautiful in the world, left her husband Menelaus for Paris, Prince of Troy. Whether abducted or complicit, her departure ignited what the Greeks claimed was the greatest conflict of their age. Kings from across the Aegean swore to honor an oath they had once taken to defend Helen's marriage, and they gathered their fleets beneath Agamemnon, king of Mycenae. The epic speaks of 1,000 ships, a number less literal than symbolic, a statement of scale. It was a war to bind together rival rulers under one banner, and in Homer's telling it became the crucible of Greek identity. The Iliad does not tell the whole war. It chooses a fragment, the wrath of Achilles. Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, the mightiest warrior among the Greeks, is dishonored by Agamemnon and withdraws from battle. In his absence, Hector, crown prince of Troy, drives the Greeks to desperation. Only the death of Patroclus, wearing Achilles' armor, forces him back into the fight. His vengeance is merciless. He kills Hector and desecrates his body, dragging it around Troy's walls until the aged King Priam begs for its return. The poem ends not with Troy's destruction but with Hector's funeral. Yet the shadow of the city's fall lingers in every line, inevitable, inescapable. Later tradition, built from fragments of lost epics and oral memory, filled in the rest. Achilles himself dies young, struck by an arrow, his invincibility pierced by fate. The Greeks cannot take Troy by force, so they turn to cunning. Odysseus conceives a ruse, a hollow wooden horse filled with warriors, left at Troy's gates as a supposed offering. The Trojans bring it inside, and at night the Greeks emerge, opening the gates for their army. Troy burns, its walls collapsing in flame. Priam is killed at the altar, his family slaughtered, his daughters carried into slavery. A war that began with love ends with ruin. Yet archaeology tells a harsher story, stripped of gods and heroes. At Hazarlik, layers of destruction mark the site again and again. Troy 6, a wealthy city with massive fortifications, fell around 1250 BCE. Its walls tumbled in what appears to have been an earthquake. No mass graves, no arrowheads, no siege equipment were found. The city collapsed, but not necessarily by human hands. Troy VIA, however, tells a different tale. Built upon the ruins of 6, it was crowded, its houses hastily built. Around 1180 BCE, it ended violently. Excavators found charred remains, skeletons lying unburied, clear evidence of fire and slaughter. This destruction occurred at the very moment when the Bronze Age collapsed across the Mediterranean, the Hittite Empire vanishing, Mycenaean palaces abandoned, cities across the Levant burned. The question is whether Homer's war is echoed in these ruins. Was Troy VIA destroyed by an enemy fleet, by Greeks pressing across the Aegean to seize the straits? Or was it another casualty of the wider collapse, when famine, invasion, and rebellion ripped apart the world system? Archaeology cannot answer with certainty, but the evidence of fire and bodies in Troy VIA speaks more closely to siege than to earthquake. The silence of weapons does not mean they were absent. The passing of millennia erases much. Yet the coincidence of date, the violent end, and the city's strategic position suggest a real conflict remembered in song. As for the heroes, archaeology offers no names. No tomb has yielded the bones of Achilles. No tablet records Hector's command. Yet Homer's characters bear the shape of real warrior kings. The Mycenaean world was ruled by such figures. Leaders who commanded fleets, who boasted of conquest, who ruled from citadels. Linear B tablets list chariots, bronze weapons, and soldiers in numbers that show the martial organization of their states. The graves at Mycenae, filled with gold masks and weapons, reveal a warrior aristocracy that glorified in both wealth and violence. The Wanaks of Mycenaean Greece lived in palaces, commanded scribes, and ruled with the authority of gods. In them lies the model for an Agamemnon or an Achilles. Hector, defender of Troy, too may echo a type rather than a man. The rulers of Walusa, recorded in Hittite treaties, were kings of a fortified city guarding trade. One of them, Alexandru, signed a treaty around 1280 BCE with the Hittite king Muwatalli II. His name, echoing Alexandros, the Greek for Paris, blurs the boundary between myth and memory. If Alexander ruled Walusa, he may have faced the same pressures that Homer's Priam endured, caught between Anatolian power and Aegean ambition. His name in Hittite records does not prove Homer's Paris, but it proves that rulers of Troy bore names that resonated in Greek memory centuries later. The war Homer sings is larger than archaeology can prove. His 10-year siege, his catalogue of ships, his duels watched by gods, these belong to poetry. Yet the fire at Troy via the treaties naming Walusa, the references to Ahiawa, the Achaeans in Hittite texts, these belong to history. The two cannot be cleanly separated. Oral tradition preserves fragments of truth even as it reshapes them into legend. A war may have been shorter, smaller, fought not for Helen but for control of trade routes. Yet, in the centuries of retelling, it became the crucible of Greek memory, the war that explained their world. The archaeological evidence of fire and destruction does not align neatly with Homer's verses, but it refuses to be ignored. Troy was real, it burned, and its ruins still bear the marks of violence. The figures of Achilles and Hector may not have lived as Homer described, but they embody the warrior elite who ruled both Greece and Anatolia in the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. They are archetypes forged from reality, sharpened by memory, and immortalized in verse. The war Homer describes may never have happened exactly as told, but the ruins of Troy and the silence of bones refuse to let it fade into mere invention. The Trojan horse stands at the edge of myth and memory, a story so vivid that even those who have never read Homer know its outline. The Greeks, after 10 years of feudal war, constructed a massive wooden horse, hollow within, and filled it with their finest warriors. They left it at the gates of Troy, sailed away as if retreating, and the Trojans, believing the horse to be a sacred offering to Athena, dragged it into their city. At night, while Troy slept, the hidden Greeks slipped out, opened the gates, and brought destruction inside the walls. It is one of the most enduring images of ancient warfare, an emblem of cunning so sharp that Trojan horse has become shorthand for treachery across centuries. Yet when history is stripped of poetry, the question remains, was this ever real? The earliest mention of the horse is not in Homer's Iliad at all. That epic ends with Hector's funeral, not Troy's fall. The horse belongs to later tradition. In the Odyssey, written around the 8th century BCE, Odysseus recounts the trick in passing, describing how he and others hid inside the giant structure. Later poets, such as Virgil in the Aeneid, 1st century BCE, expanded it into vivid drama. Laocoon warning the Trojans to beware, the serpent attack that silenced him, Cassandra's ignored prophecy, the gates thrown open, the city's last night of peace. By then, the horse was no longer just a stratagem. It was a symbol of fate itself, irresistible and destructive. But the silence of archaeology is damning. No trace of a colossal horse has ever been found at Hizarlik, the site identified with Troy. No structural remnants, no carvings, no inscriptions from the late Bronze Age speak of such an object. Even the Mycenaean world, whose art depicted chariots, warriors, ships, and animals in abundance, leaves no clear representation of a wooden horse used in war. If the Greeks truly constructed such a machine, its remains have long since vanished. The soil has preserved only fire, walls, and bones, not a single splinter of Homer's most famous contraption. This absence has fueled another possibility. The horse may not have been a literal construction, but a metaphor misunderstood across centuries of retelling. Ancient critics themselves raised doubts. In the 5th century BCE, the historian Herodotus makes no mention of the horse when he recounts Troy. Later writers like Palaephatus suggested the horse was a coded symbol, a reference to a siege engine shaped vaguely like a horse, perhaps a battering ram covered in wood and hide. Others proposed it was never a machine at all, but a memory of natural disaster. In some ancient Mediterranean dialects, horse could signify an earthquake, the horse of Poseidon. Troy, sitting on a fault line, had seen its walls collapse under seismic force before. A quake could have opened a breach in its defenses, retold in later song as a divine horse tearing through the city. Another theory ties the horse to the sea itself. Poseidon was not only the god of earthquakes but also the god of horses and of the sea. Some scholars argue that the wooden horse was a poetic image for Greek ships, their curved prows often carved to resemble horse heads. To say that warriors came hidden in a horse might have been a compressed memory of warriors disembarking from a fleet at night. Oral poetry, reshaping memory into narrative, transformed this metaphor into a single object, the horse left at the gates. Still, the lack of evidence does not erase the possibility of an actual stratagem. Subterfuge was a hallmark of warfare in the late Bronze Age. Egyptian records speak of trickery used by enemies, from ambushes disguised as retreats to smuggling soldiers inside captured fortifications. The Mycenaeans, whose military resources were vast, may well have constructed unusual machines for siege. The walls of Troy were formidable, with sloping stone bases and mud brick ramparts that had withstood assaults before. A ruse more than brute force would have been required to breach them. In that sense, whether or not a horse existed in wood and nails, the story preserves a truth. Troy fell not only to weapons but to cunning. The endurance of the horse in memory speaks to more than tactics. It became a cultural symbol of betrayal and misplaced trust. The Trojans were not conquered in open battle but undone by their own decision to wheel the object into their sanctuary. The horse became a warning carved into literature. Never trust gifts from the enemy. Never mistake apparent retreat for defeat. The Roman poet Virgil sharpened this lesson for his audience, weaving it into the foundation story of Rome. The horse was no longer just a stratagem of Odysseus. It was the hinge of fate that doomed Troy and set Aeneas on the path that would lead to Rome's founding. Yet, when stripped of later embellishment, the question remains suspended. Troy via shows fire, collapsed walls, and human remains left unburied, evidence of a city taken by force around 1180 BCE. But how the Greeks entered, through assault, through breach, or through deceit, remains unwritten in the soil. Archaeology speaks in layers of ash, not in verses. The horse lives only in words, in poetry shaped centuries after the fact, in symbols that resonated more than eyewitness detail. And still, the story resists fading. From the first recitation of the Odyssey to modern retellings, the horse dominates the memory of Troy. It is the deception that outlasts the war, the trick that became larger than the 10 years of bloodshed that preceded it. The horse is not just a detail of ancient siegecraft. It is the myth's essence, its emblem of cunning over strength, of night over day, of betrayal over valor. Whether it was a machine, a metaphor, an earthquake, or pure invention, its shadow still falls across history, long after the city it doomed has crumbled into ruins. The poems attributed to Homer stand at the threshold of history and myth, their verses carrying the weight of centuries before a single word was fixed on a page. The Iliad and the Odyssey, composed in the 8th century BCE, reach back to an age that was already 500 years gone. If a war for Troy occurred around 1180 BCE, then Homer was writing in a world utterly changed. The Mycenaean palaces that might have sent kings and warriors to Troy had long since collapsed, their writing system, linear B, forgotten. Greece had endured centuries without literacy, centuries remembered not in records or chronicles but in stories carried by the human voice. It was this oral tradition that preserved, reshaped, and transformed memory into legend. The bards, known as Ewadoi, were the custodians of these memories. They performed epic tales in palaces, marketplaces, and feasting halls, their verses unrolling in formulaic patterns that allowed for improvisation and recall. The rhythm of dactylic hexameter, the repeated epithets, swift-footed Achilles, rosy-fingered Dawn, Hector breaker of horses, were not ornamental, but functional. They allowed the bard to fill his lines while summoning entire scenes from memory. These stock phrases were the scaffolding of epic tradition, ensuring that stories survived the centuries of silence when no pen scratched parchment. By the time writing returned to Greece, borrowed from the Phoenician alphabet around the 9th or 8th century BCE, the poems had already passed through generations of performance. What was eventually written down was not a transcript of a single voice, but the crystallization of centuries of oral song. Scholars call it the oral formulaic tradition, a living art where each performance reshaped the tale, blending older fragments with contemporary values, until myth and history fused into a single narrative. This raises the question: Did Homer preserve echoes of an actual war, or only craft an imagined heroic past? Archaeology gives fragments, not certainty. The ruins at Hizarlik show that a city was destroyed in fire around 1180 BCE. In Mycenaean graves, gold masks, weapons, and treasures speak of warrior elites who might fit the mold of Homer's kings. The tablets of Hittite archives, written in the 13th century BCE, mention a place called Walusa, likely Troy, and conflicts involving a power they called Ahiowa, possibly the Achaeans of Greek tradition. These traces suggest that wars between Greeks and Anatolian cities were not mere invention. But none of this evidence records Helen, Achilles, or Hector. What survived in Homer's verses was not the war itself, but the cultural memory of conflict, reframed into the values of a society centuries later. The Iliad is not a chronicle of events but a poem of ideals. Its heroes embody the code of Cleos, glory won through battle and remembered in song. To die young in honor was to live forever in memory. This obsession with fame reflects not the Mycenaean age, but the world of Homer's own time. In the 8th century BCE, Greece was emerging from centuries of darkness, rebuilding cities, reforming social bonds, and seeking identity through shared stories. The epics provided that foundation. Achilles' wrath, Hector's duty, Odysseus' cunning. They became moral exemplars, not because they mirrored precise history, but because they expressed what Greeks believed about heroism, fate, and honor. The oral tradition also shaped the way history was remembered. Events that may once have been local raids were amplified into a single legendary conflict of Greeks united against Troy. The diversity of city-states and clans that fought in Homer's catalog of ships may reflect an attempt to weave fragmented memories into a single national past. The war became not just an episode, but the defining myth of Greek identity, retold at Pan-Hellenic festivals, binding scattered communities into one cultural memory. Even the gods woven into Homer's epics reflect this process. In Mycenaean records, the names of deities like Poseidon, Zeus, and Hera appear on linear B tablets, showing their worship centuries before Homer. But their role in the epics, descending into battle, taking sides, arguing over fate, belongs to the world of poetry, not history. The oral tradition blended divine myth with human struggle, turning a war of kings into a cosmic drama. For audiences, this did not diminish its truth. To them, the past was not a sequence of verifiable events. It was a tapestry of memory, myth, and meaning, retold to explain their present. The process of oral transmission left traces in the poems themselves. Repetition of entire scenes, such as arming sequences or hospitality rituals, reveal the bard's technique of formulaic composition. Variations in dialect, mixing Ionic, Ialic, and older forms, show that the poems were not the work of a single hand, but of generations of singers before Homer. Even the structure of the Iliad, focusing not on the fall of Troy but on a brief span in the war, may preserve the fragment of a much larger cycle of stories, only some of which were committed to writing. When the poems were finally fixed in writing, whether by Homer himself or by later scribes, they marked a turning point. Oral tradition gave way to text, and fluid performance became immortalized in a stable form. Yet even then, transmission was not uniform. Variants of the epics circulated for centuries, with the version known today shaped by the scholars of Hellenistic Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, who compiled, edited, and standardized the texts. The Homer we read is not one voice, but a layered memory of centuries. What lingers is the tension between memory and fact. Archaeology speaks of cities burned and kings buried with weapons. Hittite texts whisper of conflicts on the Aegean shore, but only Homer's verses breathe life into those bones with names and faces. The oral tradition did not preserve the war as it was, it preserved what mattered about it. It carried forward the sense of a heroic age, when men fought for honor, when gods walked among mortals, when glory outlived death. To later Greeks, this was not myth in the modern sense. It was their past, reshaped in song until it became eternal. And so the Iliad and the Odyssey endure as both history and art, history not of events, but of memory, carried across 5 centuries of silence by the human voice, fixed in writing only when the world that birthed them was already gone. yet still commanding the imagination of every age that followed. The story of Troy stands suspended between the dust of ruins and the glow of myth, a place both real and unreal, its walls simultaneously stone and poetry. Archaeology confirms that a settlement stood on the mound of Hizarlik in northwestern Anatolia, overlooking the Dardanelles, for more than 3 millennia. Layers of cities, built one upon another from around 3000 BCE until the Roman period, create a palimpsest of human habitation. Among these, Troy 6 and Troy 7, destroyed in the Late Bronze Age around the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, have drawn the most attention, their burned walls and shattered homes offering the faint outline of a catastrophe that some equate with Homer's epic war. Yet the ruins are silent, leaving only speculation as to whether this was the same conflict that poets transformed into an enduring legend. The Greeks never treated the Trojan War as a distant fable. For them, it was memory, identity, and foundation. By the 8th century BCE, when Homer shaped his epics, the story of Troy had already become a cultural inheritance. The Iliad was not about the destruction of a city alone. It was about the ideals of honor, the rage of heroes, and the fragility of human life under the gaze of the gods. Generations of Greeks found in it a mirror of themselves. Festivals, performances, and recitations of Homer's verses became instruments of education and cohesion. To grow up Greek meant to know the stories of Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus, not as distant fiction, but as part of a heroic past that defined what courage, loyalty, and glory meant. The influence of Troy extended far beyond Greece. When Rome rose to power in the centuries after 509 BCE, its poets and statesmen did not dismiss the legend as foreign. They claimed it as their own. According to Roman tradition, the Trojan prince Aeneas escaped the burning city, carrying his father Anchises on his back, and wandered until he reached Italy. From his line, the founders of Rome were said to descend. By adopting Troy as their origin, the Romans transformed a Greek epic into Roman propaganda. The Augustan poet Virgil, writing the Aeneid between 29 and 19 BCE, cast Aeneas as the embodiment of Roman duty, endurance, and destiny. For Augustus, who had just ended a century of civil wars, this Trojan ancestry was more than myth. It was a powerful political weapon, linking his regime to a divine and heroic past. The fall of Troy became the seed of Rome's imperial rise, recast not as tragedy but as providence. Western literature never escaped the shadow of Troy. Greek dramatists such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides reshaped the war into tragedies that interrogated power, revenge, and human suffering. In the Agamemnon, the king returns home from Troy only to be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra, a reminder that victory abroad could lead to ruin at home. Euripides' Trojan women presented the aftermath of the city's fall not through the eyes of victors, but through the grief of the conquered, giving voice to Hecuba, Andromache, and Cassandra as they were led into exile. The war was never just glory, it was also unending consequence. Medieval Europe also clung to Troy as a foundation for identity. In the 12th century, chroniclers in England claimed descent from Brutus, a grandson of Aeneas, who was said to have sailed west and founded Britain. French and other European dynasties made similar claims, weaving themselves into the Trojan genealogy. To claim Troy was to claim antiquity, legitimacy, and heroic inheritance. The myth had traveled so far from its archaeological core that it became a universal template of origin, reshaped for each culture that needed a noble past. Modern archaeology reopens the story with spades instead of verses. In the late 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann, convinced Homer's epics were historical truth, excavated the mound of Hizarlik. His methods were crude, often destructive, but his belief that Troy was real set a precedent. He unearthed fortification walls, burnt debris, and what he mistakenly called Priam's treasure, objects from a much earlier layer than any possible Trojan War. Later excavations refined the picture. Troy 6, with its massive stone walls and evidence of earthquake damage around 1300 BCE, and Troy VIA, showing signs of destruction by fire and arrowheads around 1180 BCE, aligned with the period when Mycenaean Greece itself collapsed. These cities were real, they burned, and their fall could easily have left an impression strong enough to endure in oral memory. Yet archaeology resists certainty. The layers of Troy reveal repeated destructions across centuries, any of which might have inspired later memory. No evidence confirms a single war that matches Homer's account, nor any horse-shaped subterfuge, nor a 10-year siege. What the mound offers is ambiguity. Enough fire to suggest catastrophe, enough weapons to suggest violence, and enough continuity to suggest survival. The site is not the proof of Homer's story, but a testament to how myth and history overlap. Each excavation uncovers not only stone but the echo of Homer's verses, reminding us how easily human memory shapes ruins into legend. The tension between myth and history gave the Trojan War its power. Unlike purely mythical tales of gods and monsters, Troy occupied a liminal space. It felt real, connected to landscapes one could still see and ruins one could still touch. This ambiguity allowed it to remain relevant across cultures and centuries. For the Greeks, it bound together city-states with a shared past. For the Romans, it legitimized empire. For later Europeans, it granted antiquity to emerging nations. Even today, it challenges archaeologists and historians to separate memory from fact, knowing that the two are inseparable in human culture. The Trojan War became more than an episode of destruction. It became a story about how human beings remember, how they shape catastrophe into epic, and how myth can carry more weight than fact. The city of Hizarlik is not only stone and soil, it is a palimpsest, each layer of ruin corresponding to another layer of story, each reconstruction carrying the burden of myth. Whether Achilles ever struck down Hector, whether Aeneas ever fled the flames, whether a horse ever breached the gates, these are questions without resolution. What endures is the knowledge that the blending of truth and imagination has reshaped history, ensuring that the war for Troy, real or not, has never ceased to be fought in the minds of those who remember it.